Thank you for joining us, Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts in marketing. You know, when you think about some of the challenges that CMOs go through today, managing and protecting a company's brand is one of the most important jobs. It used to be about the brand's identity and sales. Now it includes the more complex issues when things go wrong or your social media goes into rapid crisis mode, or there is a need to take a stand for something due to a political issue or cause when the public calls upon your brand to take a position. As the former CMO for Hershey's and TD Ameritrade, and also the marketing SVP at Capital One, Peter Horst has brought an amazing perspective into his new book, Marketing in the #Fake News Era. We discuss some of his insights from his experience as a CMO, as well as guidance on how to prepare your team's position. So let's listen in to a well-accomplished Chief Marketing Officer and a Chief Shark Officer on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective. I'd like to open the show, if you would, and tell us a little bit about your background and your career and where you got to be to today.
Sure. Well, it's funny. I was talking to a group of executive recruiters at their annual meeting the other day, and I was remembering how kind of partway through my career, I used to feel sort of sheepish about what a mixed bag of industries and companies it was until one of them said, "Oh, you have the Mosaic background. How great." And I thought, wow, Mosaic. I like that so much better than random and schizophrenic. But my career has been really a journey through lots of different arenas and types and sizes of companies. I started really the grown-up part of my career after business school when I discovered marketing was the thing I wanted to do. It was the whole brain profession that married both art and science and the math and the magic. And my first step into it was at General Mills. And I had just a great succession of experiences there over the course of 6 years, worked on a bunch of different brands from Pop Secret popcorn to Betty Crocker fruit snacks to main meals and side dishes and lots of new product work. So I learned a ton, great foundation as that kind of CPG background can provide. But I found myself just frankly getting a little bit bored after 6 years, and one planning cycle was starting to feel like the next. So at that point, I picked up my head and looked around and ran across an old friend who was at what was called US West at the time, one of the baby bell regional phone companies after AT&T broke up. And that was in the heyday of the dawn of the internet and all kinds of new business opportunities and cable data, telephony, convergence. And so it was a fascinating space, all of it needing marketing because a lot of these companies had never really had to do marketing as a regulated monopoly. So it really got my feet wet in the early days of digital and, had a lot of fun, frankly. And then, as often happens, a recruiter called and had an amazing proposition at Ameritrade, which was, at a point where the company had just gone public and the CEO wanted to spend an ungodly amount of money on marketing, but didn't have a marketing team. So I just knew that was going to be dog years of experience and growth. And so I jumped into that. That was quite the wild ride in the late 90s when, everybody's grandma was a day trader. And so built a marketing department, built a brand, really sort of had to manage this very extensive multi-channel marketing campaign with a maniacal ROI focus to satisfy this thrifty entrepreneur. Then after a few years of that, moved on to yet another switch to B2B technology. And I worked at a small cybersecurity company that had a really interesting proposition on how to help corporate environments secure their network. So that was an exercise, after having had hundreds of millions of dollars to spend. This was, how do you build a brand and drive growth with 50 cents and a toothless police dog? So I had to get very creative about email marketing and webinars and using PR as my primary brand building tool. So a lot of growth, a lot of fast learning on product management and a technology arena. And then from there, I jumped into Capital One because I was at that point feeling, I wanted to get back to what was really more of my sweet spot. I felt I had built up a lot of learning and experience that I wasn't able to leverage in that kind of environment. So Capital One was a place where I spent 12 years, an amazing ride. incredible growth and transformation and moving from, a base of credit cards to, small business and home loans and auto loans and the really big leap into banking. So lots of fascinating brand challenges, product innovation challenges, and really just thoroughly enjoyed that and learned a ton. And then after 12 years, I kind of felt I'd gone as far as I could go, and I was ready for the next challenge. And I was looking at a few different industries, as I want to do, and ended up joining the Hershey Company uh, because it was a really interesting challenge to take these wonderfully iconic, beloved brands and really see how high is up in terms of elevating the creative quality, modernizing the marketing model, and helping innovate and expand around the world. So I spent a couple of years doing that, and then made the decision to shift into what I've called Career 2.0, where I'm consulting, writing, speaking, doing some board advisory work in a more sort of independent operator mode, and that's been yet another interesting, very different challenge. So that, in a nutshell, is the magical mystery tour that has been my career.
Well, you got two new phrases that I'm going to use: the mosaic and 2.0. Those are great phrases to
Yes,
describe.
much better than random and schizophrenic.
Exactly. Well, and it does help. I did notice that you have degrees from two smaller places. It helps to have. I know a lot of people aren't going to be familiar with this brand, but Harvard and Dartmouth on top of it. That's an equally impressive background compared to the companies you've worked for. So then let's dive into things you've learned. There are a lot of things. There's a balance between creative and especially as you talk about digital and going through those types of transformations. I mean, as a in marketing today, you're going to be able to do a lot more measurement and determine a lot more ROI based on the way that you could do a lot of the tags in digital marketing. But there's still a balance with that creative and knowing whether or not an ad worked, maybe because the ad wasn't good, and that could be in all kinds, whether it's TV, radio, print, whatever, digital. Talk a little bit about that balance and how CMOs and marketers achieve the right level of balance today.
Yeah, this is a topic that I am passionate about and frankly worry about a little bit. I think the best marketing always represents a balance between art and science, and that's what I find so fascinating about marketing to begin with. But that it really calls for that sort of strategic, analytical, insight-driven grounding. But then there really does have to be a creative process, a judgment-driven leap that says, how will we then step away from the numbers and, be generative and create, something that has that kind of magic that's hard to deconstruct. And I have a worry that in the age of the algorithm and big data and increasingly AI and automation, it'll be increasingly easy to get unbalanced, and it'll be increasingly easy to abdicate a lot of what a curious, creative marketer should be doing and just be numbers driven. And again, it's not about rejecting the numbers and saying we just need to be, arm waving brand zealots, but it's about understanding what the role is of that sort of spark of human curiosity and insight. So, what questions do you ask of the data? And when, answers and insights and information come back, how do you then weave that into something that can move hearts and minds? And as opposed to just sort of let things run. And then there's also the added risk that the center of gravity of all of this technology really is towards that next sale, the short-term kind of results optimization. And I don't believe the state of the art is quite as adept at um, capturing and valuing that longer-term strategic asset that is brand, that doesn't show up in today's sales and this quarter's results, but that fuels next year's and the year after that. So I think it really calls for CMOs and marketers at every level to be, very deliberately mindful of maintaining that balance and of not necessarily just following the numbers out the window and not de-emphasizing, in their own day, in their teams, in the talent models, the skill sets and the focus and the passion for that that creative and more brand-oriented side of things that, to your point earlier, can really make the difference. An extra little twist of the lens from a creative perspective on a piece of marketing can make a dramatic difference in terms of how well it performs, once you're sort of putting it through the analytical ringer. So I think it's a difficult balance. I think it's one that's easy to lose sight of, and it's a drum I'm going to keep beating myself.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I worked heavily in TV, and there were lots of campaigns that we delivered that were millions of dollars in spend, but you were never comparing apples to apples. And it always, you can optimize a digital, banner ad, for example. You change those on any ad network, and it costs you, thousands, but not necessarily millions, where at least you can A/B test something. But when you're putting together a lot of these high level, high dollar TV buys for a major product line, you don't have the opportunity to optimize and measure in TV the same way. And a lot of times we often would see the results, and you got to be careful not to miss the forest from the trees. You look at only the results and wonder, what was the second one that we tested? Was that ad actually any good? And it's really an interesting mix to see where people fumble along the lines to get a better view of attribution, but not lose sight of the creative aspects of an ad. So,
Yeah. Well, and you touched on a really big issue, and it's something that I've been involved with in a thing called the Forbes Marketing Accountability Project. And this was, about a year or so ago, Forbes looking around and saying, wow, one of the biggest points of stress and frankly vulnerability for CMOs, because it is, the most fired of the C-suite roles, I think, um, is this whole broad question of how do I look at what I accomplished for my 305 million, 100 million, billion dollars of spend, and first know what worked and what didn't, know what I got for it, but then, almost as importantly, be able to represent to the CEO, to the board, here's what we got for it. And there aren't the kind of common practices and language and metrics for marketing accountability that there are for, say, financial accountability, right? CFOs never struggle to describe the financial picture to the board, but boards don't understand marketing. A huge percentage of CEOs don't, and there just isn't the common yardstick, the apples to apples metrics, for first figuring out what's happening, what's working, but then to make a credible show of communicating it. So it's part of a big broad challenge. And what's funny is the more advanced we get in terms of the technology and the analytics, in some ways, the more questions are raised, the less clear we are. The more the old John Wanamaker quote of, half my advertising budget is wasted, remains true when we still debate and struggle to understand, which part of it is wasted and what's working.
couldn't agree more. It's never been a good way to measure the intangibles, but try doing without them, and it then your sales start to suffer. So
Exactly.
let's talk about a little bit. You work for a diverse group of brands, and especially when you think of it from a technology standpoint, you might think of a Capital One being a more tech savvy company, and I don't know if that's true in your eyes or not compared to, say, General Mills or any of those brands, not necessarily any one, but there are a lot of brands that still struggle today with digital and technology transformation, and that can bring a lot of anxiety for CMOs as to how to advance that, especially when you think of technologies that are here today and gone tomorrow. So, and a lot of CMOs today didn't come from a pure digital background. So, what are the challenges that you see and have seen in some of those digital transformations that you've gone through? What kind of advice do you give to other CMOs and marketing departments to overcome that challenge?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and in many ways, pretty much every company is either somewhere down the path of a digital transformation or just beginning one, or thinking, boy, we're really behind, we better get going on a digital transformation. So it's something that's, as far as I can tell, pretty much on everybody's mind. And it's another one that's fraught with complexity, ambiguity, anxiety, and yet one more thing that makes the CMO role such a challenge these days. One of the things that does make it so, that whole arena so challenging, is just the vast number of players and technologies and options. I remember at last year's ANA conference, the head of the ANA, Bob Leadys, got up and first point he made was, look at this Lumascape with 5,000 little icons on it. This is a mess. It's ridiculous. Anybody who claims to understand it is lying. No one can get their mind around it. So it's a sea of sort of bewildering technologies and vendors that seem to be saying sort of similar things, and where do you start? And so it's a tough place to be, as you say, if you didn't grow up in it, which many CMOs did not. So I had a couple of principles that I tried to live as I went through it. One was to take really sort of a Maslow's hierarchy approach. There are so many things you can do, so many sophisticated opportunities and capabilities that you can build and buy and rent. But to really, true back to, what am I trying to get done? What's the job at hand? And, what are those foundational first steps I need to take? Very much a walk before you run. But, so there we are at Hershey at the beginning of our digital transformation. And, had to remind ourselves, okay, from a Maslow's hierarchy perspective, we're naked and afraid in the wilderness. We need food and shelter before we move on to self-actualization and the higher order of bells and whistles. So to really just true back to a very sort of almost architectural, how do we sort of start from the foundation and work our way up with hopefully some no regrets moves, to your point, before leaping into some cutting edge capability that is the cherry on top of a dish of ice cream you don't yet have, and that you may not want once you get a little farther into it. So that was one mindset. Another is channeling the philosopher poet Dirty Harry, who said a man's got to know his limitations. Not the most diverse statement, of course,
Sure.
these days, but the spirit of it was right, which was, before you get too excited about some shiny toy and some really thing that would be amazing to do, really think hard about where are you, what makes sense for you to take on at what point in your development. So again, back to Hershey as an example, we said, okay, we could, like some companies, build our own internal, programmatic shop, but let's sort of take stock and say we're a chocolate company in Amish country, Pennsylvania, and we're just beginning this process. So for our first step to be trying to recruit a bunch of digital cool cats to central Pennsylvania and hope to keep them, housed and fed and happy and not moving on, as we're even trying to build, back to the Maslow's hierarchy, much more fundamental foundational, components, that just didn't seem like the right thing to do at that point in time. So really, be honest with yourself about where you are and what your capabilities are as you work through this. I think there's a kind of organizational cultural component, which is you've just got to have, a really seamless partnership between CIO, CMO, IT teams, marketing teams, analytic teams. It's one where this is an all hands on deck, and you need seamless collaboration between the teams, and you can't have any kind of turfiness or infighting or credit seeking. So, to make sure that it's really a one team kind of approach, and that, you really start with what, as I say, what are my business challenges? What do we need to get done? Versus what's sort of a really interesting thing that we could do. And I think back to one of our brands, which was fantastic product that generated tremendous liking and repeat once people tried it. It just wasn't well known, and uh, I'll admit, I got personally excited about one solution that allowed us to get very, very targeted about people who sort of like dark chocolate and tried it once and used this brand and not that brand, and really just pick out the perfect customer and deliver them a very targeted message. So we did a little test, and afterwards, took a step back and said, well, gosh, first of all, we narrowed the universe to about 15 people, and probably would have been cheaper just to go buy them dinner and hand them a box of chocolate. But we also realized, truing back to the fundamental business challenge, this is a great product people didn't know about. That says shout it from the rooftops, but don't get super clever about your targeting. We got a little bit too entranced with the technology and lost sight of the problem we were trying to solve.
So let's dive into, you've got a new book coming out, Marketing in the Hashtag Fake News Era. Tell us a little bit about the book. I know it's going to be a fantastic book, but if you look at today's landscape, whether it's President Trump, if it's the president of Uber causing a crisis that gets on the news, if it's the CEO of Facebook with some bad practices, talk a little bit about what motivated you to write the book, and then some of the things that can help solve a lot of these problems that we see in today with brands.
Yeah, the book was really an outgrowth of a speech I'd given, a while ago. And then as I, talked with other conference organizers about, well, I can talk about, brand strategy and digital transformation or marketing in the fake news era. Ooh, do that one. There just continued to be interest. And, what looked like it might have been a flash in the pan kind of moment of craziness early on, the more I looked at it, the more I realized, no, there are a lot of very, sort of fundamental forces at work here that are creating a unique environment that's not going away anytime soon. And every time I talked about it, I got such interest and feedback that I said, I think there's a book in this. And so I really, the idea is that there are a number of factors at work that make this both a time of opportunity for brands, but a time of great risk. And um, they really need to be aware of that and be very deliberate and intentional in how they manage it. So, what are some things going on? You've got um, the collapse of the middle, right? That big, juicy, broad, average middle of the market has really just been kind of going away for so many reasons. We're seeing more pull to the polar extremes in terms of businesses, strength in the budget end of retail or the very, very high end, but the things in the middle like the Sears and the J.C. Penney's are struggling. We've become polarized across so many different measures: political, social, ethnic, geographic, urban versus rural. We're now just occupying the ends of extremes. So along with that, we're getting very tribalized. We're getting very attached to various parts of our identity that feel under threat, and we defend them vigorously, and that becomes an us versus them. So all of these things are just adding to the emotional tension and climate that brands have to navigate as they see this, big broad market that you used to be able to deliver a big bland message to disappearing. On top of all this, you've got a huge loss of trust. Trust levels cratering when it comes to trust in government, business, media, even NGOs. Increasing fear levels. And in the midst of that, you have consumers increasingly saying, okay, the world's broken, things are bad, it's not working for me, I'm worried about where it's going, and I don't expect government to fix it. So I will now increasingly turn to brands and companies to say, all right, you step up and make a difference. And, various surveys have shown that a majority of Americans now look to brands to play a role. Right? Don't just sell me a product, stand for something, have a set of values, and make a difference. And this is more than just the good old CSR, contribute to the Boy Scouts and, sponsor the little community parade kind of thing, but really step into the big, difficult issues of the day and have an impact. All of that at the same time when people are armed with social media and their hashtags and they're ready to pounce on companies that misstep or pounce on companies that don't step in because silence is now considered complicity, right? Doing nothing is a position. So it's really become a world where there's no safe sidelines, right? Brands, CEOs, companies can no longer just say, you know what, I'm going to sit this out. I don't do, issues. I don't do politics. And it's a world where you can be suddenly out of the blue caught in the middle of some kind of flash crisis. The NFL certainly never planned to be a political organization or play a big role in sort of social dialogue. But all it took was one player kneeling on a sidelines and then turbocharged by a president tweeting about it. And suddenly you've got, what's now an almost 2-year brand crisis that's not looking at all like it's going to go away anytime soon. But part of the challenge was the NFL was caught flat-footed and unprepared, right? They did not have a clear, articulated sense of set of values and beliefs that they could turn to when times got tough. So they had no response. There was no collective point of view. They could say, we support the players for these reasons and we're going to do X. Or we hold this other set of beliefs dear, and although we respect, what they're trying to do, here's what we're going to do and here's why, right? But there was radio silence for, a long time, which allowed others to take control of the narrative, and suddenly they're on the defensive. And that's happened time and time again by companies who, for one reason or another, are suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Look at poor old tiki torches, right? They make these cheerful little backyard ornaments, and suddenly they're on the front page of every newspaper, being held high by a bunch of white supremacist marchers in Charlottesville, Virginia. So suddenly Tiki Torches has to come out and say something, right? So that's the world that companies are operating in. And very often you hear people say, well, there's this stark choice. I can either put my fingers in my ears and my head in the sand and do nothing, say nothing, think nothing, or I leap all the way to some violently polar argument and say, I hate Trump, or I love Trump, or I'm for immigration bans, or I'm against it. But those really aren't the choices, right? There are a range of choices that I talk about in the book on how you can kind of, in a stepwise way, be more deliberate and forward-leaning on how you embrace a set of values, how you address societal needs, without necessarily going all the way up to staking out a polar position. So it's been a fascinating project. I got to talk to a lot of really interesting CMOs and PR leaders and crisis experts and social scientists. I try to provide some frameworks and guidance for how companies can work through this.
So, Peter, how should people be thinking about choices and how to deal with them to go from one extreme to the other? You referenced earlier, that vortex. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Sure. Well, I don't think I would never say there's one answer for all companies, right? Because every company is different and has a different risk profile, stakeholders that may be more supportive or less supportive about getting engaged in a deep way. So there's no one right answer, but there is one wrong answer that no company should do, which is to do nothing, hope it goes away. That just ain't happening, and you're at risk there of becoming the default brand defined by others. But in the book, I talk about kind of a curve, a risk relevance curve, which balances, how likely am I to resonate with people who agree, and how likely am I to alienate people who don't agree. And probably the most cautious conservative position is what I call values, where you just say, I'm articulating, defining the values that I and my company will live by, but I'm not going to go out and shout it from the rooftops. A step up from that would be what I call purpose, which we're very familiar with at this point. Brands embracing some form of purpose, which generally tends to be pretty evergreen, pretty non-controversial. No one's really going to fight against real beauty or fight against young girls having confidence. A step up from that in getting a little bit more sharply defined and a little bit more tension filled would be what I call issues, where you take on what is a more um, current and timely and perhaps controversial issue, but not all the way to a polar extreme. So that might be what Heineken did in Worlds Apart, where they took on the issue of, we're not having civil dialogue, or where Frito-Lay took on the issue of young people not registering to vote. Then the most sort of, strong position is what I call position, where you actually stake out an A versus B a for versus against position that is got a, sort of two polar choices, and you're most likely to have a lot of people saying, wow, thank you for standing up for that. And you're also most likely to have people saying, boy, I really disagree with that and that bothers me. So brands should very intentionally choose where on that spectrum they want to be, all the while being mindful that consumers want them to engage.
Well, Peter, I really appreciate the discussion on marketing, and I'm really excited for everybody to get the opportunity to read Marketing in the hashtag fake news era. Tell us a little bit about where we can find out more about you, your speaking engagements, and where people can get the book.
Well, the easiest place to get the book would be Amazon. And you can also, if you want to check out what I'm up to and subscribe to a newsletter, you can come by to cmoinc.com, cmoinc.com. And I appreciate share any thoughts you've got on the book or anything you're interested in chatting about. You can get in touch with me there as well.
Thank you, Peter. So there was my conversation with Peter Horst, the CMO and author of Marketing in the Fake News Era. And let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from that conversation. First, there's a balance between art and creative of advertising versus the science and attribution of measurement. Make certain to know and truly understand the insights coming back from the data you use to optimize and measure. A short-term fix may not always be the right long-term strategy. Sometimes the quality of an ad can make a dramatic difference on how it performs. Second, when thinking about putting more investment into your MarTech stack, make certain to be honest with yourself and know what your capabilities are as a brand. Does a new technology help you get to achieve the goal you're trying to achieve? And don't forget that you have to have a seamless collaboration also with your IT team so that it's a one-team kind of approach. Third, when responding to a crisis, there is not one right answer for all companies, but there is one wrong answer, which is doing nothing and having your brand be the one defined by others. Be prepared to articulate your brand's point of view. Consumers want you to engage. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you for lending your ears and for taking the time to listen to this show regarding another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. And join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.